Vayidom Aharon, and Aharon was silent. These are the words to describe how Aharon reacted or did not react to the death of his two sons, Nadav and Avihu. In this week's Parsha of Shemini in the book of Vayikra Leviticus, the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle in the wilderness, was open for business. Moshe, Haron, the Kohanim, the Levi'im were offering korbanot, offerings to Hashem. It was an exciting time, and two of Aharon's sons, Nadav and Avihu, were caught up in this excitement. And whether it was a little bit of pride or perhaps some arrogance, regardless, they wanted to give their own korban, their offering to Hashem that wasn't prescribed, that hadn't been commanded. And instead of just the korban itself being burnt up in fire to Hashem, the fire was supernatural. It exploded and it consumed and killed both Nadav and Avihu, an act which we truly cannot understand. But when the nation looked to Aharon to see how he would react, he didn't. Vayidom Aharon, he was silent. Now Moshe still went to him and he said, this is not the time for you to mourn, to break down all of the typical mourning practices. You can't do it. The spiritual future of our nation rests on your shoulders. But it seemed like Aharon wasn't looking to do all of those mourning practices. And when we look back at it, it makes sense to assume that Aharon just didn't mourn. But if we look at it that way, then we are deeply mistaken. Because if we look at Aharon and say, why didn't you break down in tears? Why didn't you tear your clothes like Yaakov in the Torah? Or all of the people who cry out for injustice? Wasn't this an injustice? You called out to defend the people who had done the sin of the golden calf. Moshe defended the people, and Avraham defended the people of Sodom, and you can't even cry out for your own two sons. But again, if we judge Aharon for this, we are missing something fundamental. We are imposing our own views and expectations upon a father who just lost his two children. We're expecting ripping of clothes. We're expecting him to want to sit Shiva and all these practices. But the rabbis put all those in place to make sure that a person would mourn in a healthy way. And Aharon mourned in the way that he needed to in that moment. He didn't not mourn because he didn't care about and love his sons. As many rabbis, Or HaChaim and others say, he was in shock. How many of us, the moment that we hear a great tragedy that we've lost someone, go into what are the practices, what are the things that I specifically need to do? Many people don't. Many people are simply in shock. And there was a 15th century Rabbi Yitzchak Abravanel, and he says it beautifully. He takes the words Vayidom, and he was silent, and he changes it to Domem, still, and says that Aharon's heart was still as a stone. He couldn't accept the words of comfort from anyone. He couldn't cry out because his soul, his speech had left him. It wasn't that he wasn't impacted by the loss of his sons. It's that the loss was so great, he was just still. He didn't know what to do or what to say. So it's not that Aharon didn't mourn, it's he was unable to mourn in the way that perhaps we expected, and eventually that he might be able to himself. So then the question is, we cannot judge Aharon because he mourned in the way that he needed to, but then the question is, who will mourn for Nadav and Avihu? Yesterday in Israel we marked Yom HaShoah, when we remember the Holocaust and the over 6 million Jews and so many millions of human beings who were murdered by the Nazis. How do we mourn for them? Because so many of the people that would mourn for them were killed as well. And this leads us to this most beautiful, comforting moment between Moshe and Aharon. Moshe is discussing with Aharon, saying, again, you cannot mourn now. The nation is resting on you, even though Aharon wouldn't have been able to mourn in the way that we expected anyways. But then Moshe uses these words. He says to Aharon, Kol Beit Yisrael yivku et hasrefa asher saraf Hashem. All of Israel is going to cry out over this fire which has burned up these people, the fire of Hashem. And he's saying, Aharon, I know you're not able to mourn right now. I know you are in a state of shock, but we are going to mourn by your side. We are going to stand with you and support you. Aharon was silent. Moshe and the people were his voice. 6 million were silenced, and we will be their voice. With that, I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.